Right now then, to start looking at this Angular app, I've got the Node backend running right now, and I have placed into the public directory, I guess I'll need yet one more thing here, which is File Explorer. I've placed into the public directory a whole bunch of stuff, and that's what we'll be concentrating on. There is an index.html file that is the top level file for the application. We'll be starting with that. And then there are various subdirectories, each of them generally having a JS file, and then one or more small HTML files that will be pieces of the DOM that we'll be looking at in the Angular app that we'll be walking through. Angular, as we'll talk about in a bit, likes to start with a largely empty DOM and then assemble pieces of it with subtrees expressed in their own HTML files that are plugged into the bigger DOM. The term partial is used to describe that. And there's a lot of vocabulary with Angular too, so let's be sure we get those terms down as we go. A partial is an HTML snippet that is not meant to be the entire page you're looking at, but a subtree of it. And Angular does a lot with partials. So the public directory will then be our focus for the content. And this is a completely different branch then from the directories we've been looking at for the server side. And be sure you're clear that we are talking about two very distinct pieces of software, even though they comprise one full web application. The server side is what we've been looking at so far. The client side runs on the browser. It is also JS. It has a lot of similarities in terms of the kind of design things that go on, so it's easy to mush them together. But be clear that we're really talking about two programs. And in practice, of course, while I'm running them both on the same machine here, in truth, they would run on very different machines, perhaps on different continents. And they are distinct pieces of the same app running in two different contexts, right? So client side, then, is what we're at now. Okay, so how does this thing look? Well, I've got a browser up here that shows it. Nothing too fancy. This end, the left-hand side, is the actual app. The right-hand side is a console and debugging console, the same one we've looked at a little earlier on Chrome, Control-Shift-I to get to the debug console. We'll be using that, but this is what the user would see over here. It allows you to log in, and we'll enter in an email. I have already run the dbload script that sets up several users. And so I'm going to assume they're already there. User A at domain A is one of them. And password A. Nope, not quite. Let's try it again. There we go. And he already has a number of attempts that he has made on a number of different challenges, right, which are also already in the database by virtue of the dbload script. And so here are his attempts, and they show a brief summary of the challenge that he made an attempt against, state of the attempt, is it quit or not, when he started, any score he's got so far, if applicable, otherwise NA, and then a means of starting a new attempt, and also a means of drilling down and looking at the individual steps of an attempt. These are buttons here. However, as we'll see, they don't do much yet. You'll be adding them later. We'll just look at the structure that leads up to this and then use that as a model for later work, either in class or as part of the project. Starting a new attempt. You can see some activity, though. They are posting to the console. And that illustrates why we want the console up. If we're putting in debugging plugins in this code, as we will plenty of, they'll appear here in the browser console. And again, it shouldn't be a surprise that they are appearing here, right, and not here. I do have some console logging going on here. I still have a lingering log that posts each and every URL that is routed on Node. But of course, this is on the server side, and this is on the client side. The console log goes different places. Okay, so that's the page we need to deal with. Our page is, I guess. Now, do notice, by the way, that it's all under localhost 3000. Right? And what's happening as I move around is that the URL is changing, but it's always localhost 3000. There's not anything the only thing that changes after it is after this hashtag. How many people here know what a hashtag and a URL means? Raise a hand for me. Okay, so let's talk a little about that. These are not actually separate pages being invoked. In a normal website, you'd have a main page, and then there'd be subpages and subdirectories, and there'd be the own HTML files, and you drill down and get information on, you know, this branch or that branch of the website. This is a single page application. There is, in principle, only one HTML page going on here, even though you're seeing different things come up as I press buttons. And that's being done by altering the DOM of that one page. The URLs you're looking at, very importantly, have that little pound sign in the middle. That pound sign mark identifies a fragment within a page. Everything before the pound sign identifies the page. Everything after the pound sign identifies, at least traditionally, 10 years ago, a marker within the page. You've seen HTML pages where there's a link that jumps down within the same page, right? If you looked at the URL, you'll find that to instruct the browser to jump to a point within a page, you use one of these fragment things. There's a pound and then a identifying label for the point you're supposed to jump to inside the current page. That was their original purpose. And it has been entirely co-opted by Angular and other similar libraries to instead identify a state or sub-situation within the single page application, and that translates really to what DOM picture we're showing right now. Okay. Again, from the top, a single page application starts with an index HTML and a DOM. It has events where you click on stuff, but instead of going to a different page or loading a different page, it fetches a bit of HTML perhaps, or maybe it generates it on the fly, stuffs that right into the current page, and shows you different views all within that same page. Yeah?
So if, say, like we went into the next page and we copied the URL and set it as a link to someone, would they go to that view or would they start at the beginning?
Okay, good question. So how do bookmarks tie in with all of this? Because in the traditional website, of course, if I start with index.html and I drill down without these pound sign business, just slash, you know, topics slash topic one, and I bookmark that, I can go back to that same subpage within the site with the bookmark. But here there isn't a subpage, and yet there is at least the fragment identifier, and that'll be part of the bookmark. And assuming the single page application is smart enough to go and find that identifier, fragment identifier, in the URL you give it, and rewire itself to show you what it's supposed to if that fragment is present, it'll work just like a bookmark normally does. And you're going to find single page apps, by the way, that don't do this. They don't actually mark the situation they're in inside the URL. So in that case, you'd have localhost 3000, and if I do a submit or I do a display of the person or what have you, this doesn't change at all. Anybody seen a web app like that? When you go to a page, you've got a steady URL, the URL doesn't change one bit, but you're pressing buttons and all sorts of stuff is changing on the page. That can happen, and is not uncommon in older single page applications. But it has the irritating problem that the bookmark is useless. It doesn't know what state it was in from the URL alone. A better designed one will show the situation in the URL as well as, of course, on the page. And that's what we're dealing with here. That's a hard thing to do, by the way. It takes an awful lot of JS, unless, of course, you're using a nice library for it, which we are. So one of the things you get from Angular's development environment is the ability to do this kind of tracking. Yeah. So let's see. What does the starting page then look like? Let's look at that. I've got my Atom editor here up, and we'll look at it. Well, let's see. Unsurprisingly, there are a lot of script includes. Even those do bear a bit of comment, by the way. First of all, a HTML page may include script things, and we've talked about this a little already, script tags, and these load from the same server other JS code, right? So these will be loading in my files, home controller.js, register controller.js, and so forth. If you're using any kind of a library, you also might have that library loaded by a script file. But there are other choices than loading it from your current server. Okay? So you can instead, as here for instance, load the script where the source is actually an entirely different website. This is the Angular library being loaded, and it is coming from Ajax Google APIs COM. Google provides a copy of the Angular library publicly available, and a lot of people use that to load in the JS for Angular on their page rather than keeping it on their local server. There are some advantages and disadvantages to doing it this way. I could instead have pulled it out of my local server from my Bower components directory, which, as we'll see in a bit, is the kind of equivalent of the node modules system that you have on the server side, same idea. But if I do, I have to serve it, right? As opposed to Google's huge pipes taking care of serving it to whoever is using my page. And then also I have to make sure it stays up to date, whereas we can be very sure that Google's will stay up to date in general. So there are advantages to fetching this from other places. And that does take, at least it surprised me the first time I saw it, that not all my JS for this page is going to come from me. It will come from libraries that I pull elsewhere dynamically onto the page. There is a notable disadvantage, although it's hard to say it's exactly a disadvantage. Does anybody know what the biggest problem with this is? You might think of a difficulty with doing it. I had it just today. I was logging in. I wanted to check out my page, preparatory to the class, and it blew right up on me. Say again? They could, but that's going to be a problem either way, right? Because I'm going to load this library either from my installation of it on my server or from Google's. So clashing of names is something you do have to deal with, but be the same either way. Now, the problem is I hadn't logged in yet to Secure Mustang Wireless, so I had no web access, which would be okay if I were developing on my own machine locally, right? I can be completely in a Faraday cage and work my own site and play with it. If it's served locally, all the stuff is local, and also I'm browsing locally. Of course, you don't normally use a web page that way, but if you're developing, it is a bit of a nuisance. You actually have to be wired in to even so much as look at your page because it's going to be drawing this stuff from elsewhere. So you got to watch out for that. It's always a surprise when you realize that you can't just work wireless or without connectivity. Okay, there are several other things I'm bringing in here, and there's a site CDNS. CDN is a network of these that you can get, and so we're getting it from CDN.js Cloudflare.com. And this is the Angular UI router and Angular UI Bootstrap. There are several different JS libraries that are part of the Angular family. People include other libraries that you can make use of and that commonly are used. So Angular is the core, and others you include on top of that. I'm including UI router, which takes care of this business of keeping track of my URLs and my fragments and routing from page to, well, from appearance to appearance based on the URL. We'll look in great detail on how it works in a bit. And then I'm also including UI Bootstrap, which is a suite of functions rather like what we saw in jQuery UI that allow us to animate HTML and make it look more like a traditional GUI control. Dialogues and forms and all that stuff. Anyway. That's all the header prologue. What does the main thing look like? Yeah, that's it. It's really just a skeleton to be filled in. And in fact, in Angular apps, especially those that use that router that I'll be talking about, the tag UI-view is especially meant to mean a place we're going to hang more stuff on here. And so there'll be something hung there plugged in as the child of UI-view. All we're doing is marking a placeholder. It's very typical for an Angular app. Not too much in the index HTML. It could be more than this, but generally not too much. The thing instead is going to operate by plugging new HTML in as we go. Good. Let's look at this briefly. An attribute on the body tag with the prefix ng dash. Angular apps all have this sort of thing going on in the HTML. Attributes, suffixed by ng, which is Angular's common abbreviation. They use the ng prefix for this stuff. So this is not standard HTML. This is an attribute that is meaningful only within the context of Angular. And it hints at a larger picture here, a general principle. Angular requires you to annotate the HTML that you want to display with these little attributes to instruct it as to how to manage your HTML and to modify it and alter the DOM and so forth. Whereas in a library like jQuery UI and jQuery, you hand tweak the HTML. With Angular, you abstractly describe how you want it manipulated, but the HTML itself you never personally modify through commands, at least not except in special cases we'll get to later, but generally you do not modify the HTML yourself when you're dealing with Angular. You let Angular do it for you under your configuration and instruction. And the ng app is an example of that. Again, what it means we'll get to in a little bit. Okay. I do have a top-level JS file, chsapp.js. So let's look at that. Again, there's not a lot going on here. Or, well, not much code, but there's a lot to be said here. One of the major concepts in Angular's library design is that of a module. It's a term we hear a lot in software abstraction in general. Specifically, in the Angular world, it means a group of what are called injectable services. And again, the meaning will get clearer as we go along here. But any Angular application comprises one or more modules. And you start with the module for the app itself. It creates a module for its own code. But that then may include other modules for things like the UI routing we were talking about, or the Bootstrap UI, and so forth. And again, how that works we'll look at in a minute. This line here then is using the Angular object, which is the one top-level object that Angular injects, rather like the $sign object for jQuery, remember that from last week. And it includes, among other things, a module function that creates a module. And the module arguments are the name of the module, we'll call ours main app, and then dependencies, other modules that this module will use. Their names given as strings in an array. What comes back is an object representing one module. It is unfortunate that the local or global, actually, variable app is traditionally used, or my app sometimes, to describe this because it makes you think there's an application object of some sort. That should have been my main module, or another similarly descriptive name, because it is a module that it points to. However, for reasons of tradition, it's called my app or app in almost every Angular app, so I kept it that way. But don't forget that app is not an app, it's a module. Again, more detail on modules as we go, but the closest concept to them would be like a Java package, for instance, or a link library in other kinds of contexts. So a collection of code that can be used by others. And we're in a sense saying our module main app will use as libraries the UI router and the UI bootstrap. But again, those are modules instead. Now, I didn't even want to look at this filter thing yet. You can ignore it for the moment. Although I suppose there's one brief aside that's worth noting, and that is that the module then has, yeah, not even that. Just leave it be for now. We'll get back to it later. Okay. We're going to assume by magic that that first page comes up. I want to look at how it was described, and then how it came up we'll deal with when we get to the router, which is done by the router. So the first page, the one with the login and the register buttons, is under public home, and the HTML for it is here. It's just a couple of buttons. That's a standard HTML tag button in a div. But what's going on within them is a little more complicated. First, another one of those ng things. So this is apparently some sort of Angular instruction, and it's got a bit of JS code in it. Although it looks like a global function call, it actually isn't, as we'll see, but it has that appearance. There are some style classes, and these are just for style. They make the button look a certain way, and they're automatically supplied as part of the Bootstrap UI. It's got a CSS file that we also included, as you may have noticed, and it gives us all manner of nice styles for buttons and so forth, and we're using those here. And the button itself, obviously, these buttons either say login or register. So all I've got here is a page that has two buttons that are styled nicely and have some kind of function call to apparently go to a login page, or alternatively to a register page, which we didn't show, but we could. It's not surprising. It's just a form to register. But along with it is some JS. And this sets up what is called a controller, a very simple version of it anyway. And there again, a large discussion to be had. How many people here are familiar with an MVC, Model View Controller Design Pattern? Okay, you've heard of this. Good. So, only a few though. So let's talk in general about this. It goes beyond Angular. It's a design concept that has been part of GUI design for, I would say, 25 years now. And the notion is that any GUI program has, in effect, three major parts. The first we'll call the model. And that is the underlying data structures that represent the state of the program at any given time. Who's logged in? What attempts are we looking at? What are their fields? Those sorts of things, the data structures that you are displaying. And the model has a close relationship to the REST service. It is not the REST service, it's a copy in the client side, but still there's an awful lot of go get stuff from the REST service that becomes part of the model kind of action. And then there are two other components that deal with the interaction with the user. The first, the V in MVC, is the view. And that, as its name implies, is the appearance, the thing you throw up on screen. If you're on Android, it's a bunch of Java classes for describing buttons and forms and so forth. If you're in Angular, it's a bunch of HTML, again, showing the same sort of thing. So no matter what the particular manifestation is, the view is the display of the model. And then there is the controller. And the controller deals with user input and responding to the user input, modifying the model. If you click on a button saying, I want to log in, we change the model so that now you're logged in, and whatever state is needed to be shown in the model indicates that you're logged in. The view, which is displaying the model, changes also. Now, these separations into different parts, why would you bother doing that? What's the big point of that kind of separation? There are several advantages to it. First, just the comprehension of different parts of the app is easier. This is a simple thing with a few lines of code in it, but in a real one that had tens of thousands of lines, it's useful to be able to deal just with the data, or just with the view, or just with the interaction that deals with clicking and mouse events and so forth from the user, and have them be separate pieces. It's the same argument for any other kind of modularity. Software is the most complex artifact in human history. Separating it into pieces that you can understand one at a time is good. Also, the kind of talent and background that deals with, say, a model versus a view may be different. The view has more to deal with aesthetics and styling and so forth. And you may find people working on the view who don't want to deal with code deeply. And vice versa, people who work in code don't want to touch CSS with a 10-foot pole. So that separation of people is also an advantage. And then very importantly, testing is a big problem with UI, with GUI apps, because to test, it's not like you can just enter a canned input file in a text input, the way I do with a lot of the programs that I use in my courses, right? I have you submit something, we just feed a text file to it with a less than. That's great, but no one uses text input anymore in programs. And the only way to test a GUI is to have some automatic thing that goes in and presses the buttons. There are such tools. But they're very fragile, because if you change the location of the button, it's in a different spot, they don't know that it's changed. You have to redesign your whole input to press in a different spot on the screen and so forth. So to what degree you can separate off the testing of components and keep the GUI part as concentrated in one little area as you can, the easier it is to test. And the MVC model makes that possible. You can drive the data and watch the data's changes without actually having an HTML view at all under test and check things that way. So all those reasons. Now, I said something in passing that I want to make sure everyone noticed. If I do a login, I said the model changes to show you're logged in and the view changes correspondingly. How does that happen is the important question. What code action makes the view change? Well, one way you could do it is to say, well, anytime the model changes, it should go over and modify the HTML from the model. But that means that the model would need to know about the HTML and need to be aware of the view components, and those would all be tangled into the model logic. Instead, the better abstraction is to use yet another design pattern called subject observer, or just observer if you've done the traditional Gang of 4 object-oriented design book. Many people are familiar with a subject observer design pattern. Okay? So in a subject observer design pattern, what you have is a subject that can be, in the traditional language like Java, just an object, and so it is also in JS. And so this might be our model, for instance. And then you have another observer that waits for changes to the model, the subject, and updates itself whenever the thing it's observing changes. In code, this typically takes the form of the model having a list of other objects that want to know if it changes. And whenever the model changes, what it will do is walk that list of other objects that want to know about it and call a designated method on them saying, I changed, I changed, I changed. And the rest of the work is all theirs. They go look at the model, do get calls on the model in response to that update call, and change themselves. Another name for the pattern is a publish and subscribe model. You'll hear it described that way too from time to time. In a situation where I have one object with a state that may change, and which other objects are interested in the change and want to update themselves in some way of their own, and they register themselves with the observed subject, which does nothing more than keep a list of who is interested and call everyone on that list a standard method on each one if it changes, and then the observers deal with it from there on. It's an event handling model as well, if you want to look at it that way, but wired into the objects within your code. That's the way Angular does update of views. The underlying model we will look at changes, and the views change automatically, from our point of view at least, by virtue of things like the code we're looking at here in a bit and the Angular NG annotations in the HTML. Angular automatically sets up event handling systems and update lists like the one I just described, so that if you change the underlying data, the HTML changes automatically for you. And there is no code that does it directly. It just happens automatically. Yeah. What I'm setting up here is a controller. And remember, app is the module for my entire application. And it will set up working objects for different parts of the app of different types. And we'll see various different types as we go along. But an important one is the controller. Every sub-page that we look at, like the login page, will have some HTML, we just looked at to describe it, and some JS code whose job is to deal with anything the user does and modify the model accordingly. The controller part of the MVC model. You declare one by the controller call on your module. It has a controller method. You give it a name. And a dependency injection description. I'm afraid that we're hitting one design pattern after another here. I warned you that it's a very different way to look at code. I can promise you at least that they won't keep coming at 5-minute intervals for the entire 3 hours here. We're at a last major big design idea, and that is dependency injection. I'm sure all of us have written object-oriented programs, perhaps in Java, where we set up connections, uses relationships between objects. So one object has a pointer to another one to get work done. And the first object will call methods on the other one via that pointer. The classic object-oriented description is it's a uses relationship. And you can visualize very many object-oriented applications as graphs of objects, with the objects having pointers to one another as needed to get work done and to pass work off to one another via following the pointer and making method calls. The traditional way to set that graph up, if you will, is to either pass to each object as it is constructed, as constructor parameters, pointers to the other objects that are needed. So you're going to be a database manager object, and you need a pointer to the database interface that you're going to address to do your database management. It's passed in your constructor, and you hold on to it as a member data. Or alternatively, you might have a setter that says set this connection, and you can pass a reference to it. But whichever way it's done in a traditional object-oriented program, it's pretty hardwired. You may even create the thing yourself. Maybe that's a third method too. If you do a new and create another object and you own it by reference, that's another alternative. But it's all, again, very hardwired. The modern dependency injection design pattern arranges a similar kind of graph, but in a very flexible way. Each different object knows which other objects it needs and describes what those needs are in some orderly fashion, which we'll look at here in a moment. That's that array. And then an external coordinating system gives it the objects that it wants, the dependencies that it has, the other objects it needs, are injected. Now, that can be done by a setter call, or it can be done by a constructor call, like I just described. But the important point is, you can arrange it so that different ones are injected in different configurations. So that if I need, for instance, a database interface, and I am a database managing object, I describe, I need to have a database interface object injected. I don't say, I want to create this particular database interface object and I'll use it. I just say, just give me one in my constructor. And I let an external system decide which one I'll get. The advantage of doing this is that normally I'll get a working one that actually talks to a database. But maybe I want to do some kind of testing, or I don't want to talk to the main database, and instead I want a mock-up that looks like the main database and acts like the main database, but is not actually. The external dependency injection system can decide to give me a database interface that isn't really, it's a mock-up, and I'm none the wiser. So if we have other modules that we need to use, rather than hardwiring them, we'll describe what we need, and an external system that coordinates the connections will pass them to us. But it may decide to give us different versions of them, or test versions, or other things like that, based on configuration that's outside of us. dependency injection. So a number of terms here. Make sure you're at least at the high level, and you can Google all this stuff up, by the way. Dependency injection will get you millions of hits. MVC, a subject observer or just observer design pattern that goes with it. Dependency injection. And those, I believe, are the major new ways of thinking about stuff. So that's the extent of the list at this point. So with that background in mind, what am I doing in this array? I'm saying I need an object that represents a scope. What that means in a bit, we'll see. And another one that represents a router state. That would be the URL. What branch of the URL? The fragment tag, in effect. And then I supply a function that will create the controller object. I'm not actually creating the controller object yet. I'm describing how to create it. And this is, in fact, a constructor, the function. Although it isn't used like a standard JS constructor, it'll just get called. It has two parameters, a scope and state, that will be the scope and state objects injected into this controller object when it is created. The dollar signs are a common naming theme in Angular. Things that are built into the Angular system are often prefaced with a dollar sign. As we already know, that doesn't make them anything other than a weird-looking name. There is no special syntax significance to a dollar sign in a name. It's a convention. But because those are standard things in the Angular constellation of possible objects, they're given a dollar sign name. Importantly, that doesn't mean that it has to be exactly the same name as the parameters, although they will correspond at least. The scope that we're given will be passed to our parameter scope. The state we're given will be passed to our parameter state. I'm giving them different names here, although you'll often see them named identically in this notation in Angular code, because I want to emphasize that this is a description of the kind of service you need, kind of dependency you need, and this is the actual dependency that will be passed to you. Trying to see whether this is enough that we need a break at this point, even if it's been just 40 minutes. Let me see if I can finish this one up and then we'll take a break. So what is a scope? I said I'd describe that in a minute. The scope is the model. More exactly, there are a lot of different scope pieces, and they all tie together in a tree-like structure we'll get to later, but bottom line is the scope is the model in this case, the underlying data. And the state, as I mentioned, is a service that allows me to tell the single-page app, the Angular app, to go to a different URL, different fragment, and show a different thing. You can see how I'm using the state in here. Apparently it has a go method, and then a string describing the state I want to go to. So this little function here, the go to login function I'm attaching to my scope, would, if executed, cause me to jump to the login page. And this one down here, go to register, very similar, causes me to go to a register page. So all the code for this controller is doing is attaching two methods to the scope that will allow me to redirect it to other places. The HTML had just go to login and go to register. Why did it say scope dot or dollar scope dot or something like that if these are attached to the scope? And the answer is that it is assumed that any data you refer to in an Angular reference within HTML or any function you call is a part of the model, the scope. It's the controller's job to set up the scope, and the HTML uses the scope, the model, either by calling methods on it or by, as we'll see shortly, extracting data from it and displaying it, or in some cases, writing data into the scope. That's our first miniature example of an MVC pattern. This here is the V, the view, that addresses the M, which we didn't really explicitly declare, but is our scope. And the controller, the C, is the object that arranges for the interaction to be conducted properly by setting up these methods in this case. We'll see lots of other scopes, or other controllers doing other things as well. Yeah.
Are there different patterns of MVC? Because I learned that the view can't talk to the model and the controller talks to the model when the view talks to the controller.
Not generally the view talks to the controller, no. Usually it's the model is center, and the view and the controller are kind of associated working on it. Okay. Let's take a break for 10 minutes, resume at 7:05, and we'll look at some of the other pages that go with this. Such a pain in the ass. Okay, so Camtasia being happy now, I hope. I did a little diagram up on the board, and I'm sorry for the Camtasia viewers, but I'll at least do a quick verbal on this and a picture for those in the room. I want to describe what I would call a MVC group. That's my own term. I don't know if there's a standard Angular term for it or not. This thing comes up again and again in Angular design, so you got to understand. If I have a portion of my HTML like those login buttons, which I'm drawing up here as a rectangle, there will be a scope object that is the model, which the buttons will look at, or the HTML in general will look at, and a corresponding controller that will govern the scope and set up functions to modify it and fill it in with data and maybe do REST calls to fill it in or whatever you have. The connection between the view and the scope is automatic. You describe it abstractly in ways we'll look at, and that causes the view automatically to be updated. The triple, a scope, some HTML, and a controller, appears again and again. In each page we'll be looking at, register, login, attempts, there'll be a controller and a scope and the HTML for that. It doesn't even have to be whole pages. You can have a large page, portions of which have different scopes underneath them and different controllers running them. So I could have a big page here that has a big controller and a big scope with it, and then a small piece of that is subpage. It's got its own subscope and its own subcontroller. They can be, in other words, hierarchical. And when they are, by the way, the scopes have a kind of inheritance relationship. This smaller scope automatically defers to the bigger scope for properties that it doesn't have. So you can define a sub-area of data that adds to the bigger picture its own little narrow extra stuff for one narrow part of the HTML with its own controller to set it up. The way that the controller is determined for a given piece of HTML varies. In our app, we'll find that it is being done by the router. In other contexts, there are Angular annotations that you can put on a subtree of your HTML. This div has ng controller, and you give the class name of the controller directly. And it'll understand that means that it should create an object of that controller type, which will set up a scope, which will be the underlying data for this part of the HTML. However it's done, each bit of HTML gets a scope underneath it, and that scope is created and managed by a controller. And what controller is to do that is configured in several different possible ways, ranging from annotations straight on the HTML, which we're not using here, but is easily shown in the book, another example code that you can look at, or by the router system that we will be using here. I did want to make it a little real that there is something going on to make that click connection. I said it was magic, that the click handler in the login button, for instance, would be connected to the scope. I'm not going to show all the details because even I don't want to read that much Angular, but I have here event listeners for the login button. Oh, pressed in, it worked. Event listeners for that login button here. That's my display of the elements, the DOM tree in the debugger panel. And here are event handlers for it, and there's a click one. Apparently there are a couple of click handlers, and they're wired into different parts of Angular.js, the Angular library. So that's how it's really happening, is the Angular is setting up this thing so that the click will call the right thing in the scope. But it's behind the scenes. It's not something we do explicitly. Okay, so when I press login, I get this, as we already saw earlier. And that is its own piece of HTML, automatically plugged into the DOM by the router. And it has its own controller and its own scope. Those are in login template.html. And you can see that it's a div that has a form a standard HTML tag for anything that you'd fill out as a form with fields to enter and a submit button. And then a field set, that, if I recall correctly, is supplied by the CSS for UI Bootstrap. I'd have to look it up, but that's a special one. It identifies a group of two things, a label and a thing to enter. So the field set has a label, email address, and then an input. And again, if you remember, your HTML input is used for a variety of different kind of input HTML controls, from checkboxes to radio buttons to edit boxes, which is what we're actually doing here. Right? Class form control makes it look pretty. The interesting thing is the ng model. Again, that's a Angular attribute, so it's going to be describing to Angular something to set up. When you give in the attribute string of an ng model a JS expression, what you're saying is this HTML is tied to that thing in the scope. As before, it's not a global user.email, that's scope.user.email. And a similar tie-in is made for scope.user.password for the password. Let's look at the controller to see the other end of that. This one's a little more complicated. Same basic pattern. We are declaring it by using the controller method of our overall module, saying we will have a controller that is called this, login controller. That'll let us identify what controller object we want to have in various ways. It will require these other injectable services. It'll require a scope to be worked on, the scope that underlies the login page, and its job will be to set that up. It's going to require, once again, the state object that is supplied by the router system so it can do go and go someplace. Because it does a post of a session, it requires an object that lets it do HTTP requests. And then it requires a notify dialog service that I set up, and we'll look at later, that lets it do a little pop-up if the login fails. Those are its connections to the rest of the program. And again, they're arranged by dependency injection. It doesn't create a notify dialog object of its own. It does not personally go and look up the HTTP library and do a new HTTP connection. It says, I'd like to do HTTP. Please give me an object that let me do HTTP. And whenever the thing is actually created by the larger system, the dependency injection system, it will be given, the function that creates the controller will be given 4 parameters corresponding to what I asked for. They don't, again, have to be the same name, although they often are named the same. Based on what I said earlier, kind of a larger design question, would you expect exactly the same object to be passed to satisfy the HTTP request under all circumstances, or not? And the question itself implies probably not, but why not? What would be a compelling reason to say, look, depending on how I set up the larger DI, dependency injection system, maybe you'll get the standard HTTP interface object that lets you talk to a REST service, and maybe you won't. And you don't need to worry about it. It'll look the same either way. Apparently we can do stuff like HTTP.post calls. Not surprising. And there's a get and a put and a delete as well. Stuff you'd expect. But why would I expect a completely different object sometime than the one that actually talks to my REST service? Alex, what do you think? Why would I want a different object? Yeah, yeah.
Maybe it's talk directly to the database.
Could be. You want to talk straight to a database. Another possibility is I want to test this thing, and I don't want it talking to the REST service while it's being tested. I want to set up a mock service that acts like an HTTP connection, but isn't really. It's just a mocked up one. That way I can test it without having to do a network connection and run it very quickly. One of the things you'll find when you do repeated heavy regression tests on websites, which has to be done because they're released very often, is that they take a lot of time. You don't want to necessarily go all the way to a REST call and take 27 milliseconds to go and do a database hit. What you want is that fast instead. It's 1,000 or 1,000,000 times faster, so you can run a lot of tests. And so you set up a little mock HTTP thing that is very limited in what it can do, but it's good enough for testing. And that allows me to give that as the $HTTP parameter here. If I tell the dependency injection system, hey, anyone asks you for HTTP, don't give them the real thing. We're running a fast test here. Just give them this mock-up. And the controller will never know the difference. That's the reason for dependency injection, that you can have very flexible satisfaction of these needs. As long as you give it an object that does the post call and whatever other calls it's anticipating, we're good. Right? And in a Java environment, you'd at least have to have a formal interface. It would have to answer to the HTTP caller interface. But this is JS. We don't even care about that. All it means is duck typing. If it's got the methods, it's the type. That's good enough. Okay. What's this thing going to do then? Well, first off, it's going to set up a property of scope, user. And it'll be an empty object. For now, at least. That, in fact, is exactly what we were looking at in login template. Remember, user.email? That's actually scope.user.email. Angular will set up the magic connection with event handlers as necessary, transparent to us, so that any change we make to this input field will automatically go straight to that scope email or scope user email property. In fact, not only will it do it character by character. That property will constantly change value as letters are typed. It's that much of a tight event loop. So it's almost as if the email value of user is in that field and being directly modified for all intents and purposes. Now, you can see down at the bottom, by the way, we didn't mention it, but there is a button to do the login, and that calls the login, right? Looks like a global function call, but it's not, right? It's scope.login automatically. And so over here in login controller, we do have a login function. That's what will get called if that button is pressed. By the time it is pressed, we presume that the user will already have filled in the email and the password. Those will be ready to go. And so we'll just use them. We're going to pass, in fact, scope.user straight to the HTTP post call. It's a pretty simplified version of posting. There are options you can use, but for now, I'm just going to post to sessions. And I've already configured this earlier so that it's got the right REST connection and all. So this is just the suffix of the URL. And that's the body, which, as you may recall, requires an email and a password. So that post call is made. And what this then stuff is, involves doing another call to do a get to, once we know the session, get that session data. And we'll look at the detail in a minute. I'm just giving you the top level picture. And then from that, get the person ID that was logged in, which is part of the session information you get back from the session. And we will then do a go to look at the attempts that that person has and parameterize that with the person ID so that we'll get attempts /2 or whatever it may be, or pers2 attempts, that order. Now, again, more on this later, but the bigger picture is just that we have this connection to the user scope, and the user in scope, user property of scope, automatically from the HTML, and a connection to this login button to use that when we want to log in. And there's more going on too. In the login HTML template, what is this here? ng disabled. Well, it looks like it's another one of these Angular attributes, right? Apparently with an expression that is to be interpreted in the context of the scope. And it's saying it's disabled if it's not user password, so if user password is like empty, or if it's not user email. User email is not yet filled in. And I think I lied a little bit when I said it would do character by character. I think it fills in the user email only when the email is properly formatted as an email, so that no string will ever go in the user email that is not properly formatted as such. What is this doing? Well, let's look at the behavior of the login page a little more closely here, and you'll see what it's doing. Okay, so I can't submit. It's blocked. We've all seen pages like this. There are plenty of them these days. Still can't submit because I don't have an email here. Okay, now it satisfies that's an email, but I still don't have a password. Now I have a password and an email. Now I can submit. I still may be wrong, of course, but at least I can force that format. That's what the ng disabled is doing. It is automatically and continuously checking these two properties of the scope. And if either one of them is falsy, then disabled is true, bang, inverting the sense of it, of course. So if either one of them is falsy, then the disabled is true, and the button remains disabled. That's some fancy subject-observer thing going on there. Notice it isn't even looking at the input. It didn't say check the input, it said check the scope. So now what I've got is some event handling thing that as I type into these inputs is updating the scope, but the scope itself is also aware that things care about its current content, in particular the disabled property of the button, and that will automatically be updated as the scope changes. Lots of ripple through, I got changed, so you got to know that I got changed, and so on, going on underneath the scenes here, set up automatically by Angular. One of the complaints about Angular, by the way, as a library, is that it is update happy. It's got all sorts of events checking this, that, or the other thing, and you touch one thing, and all sorts of action goes on in the code. The attitude, I guess, is that the browser is there for your pleasure anyway, and your machine is pretty fast, so that's good enough. But it does have a disadvantage if you're getting really, really big pages sometimes. Yeah. And it takes a little getting used to, too. Just a pure abstract relationship that is maintained by an underlying event handling system. Okay. I told you there would be no more big design concepts, and I just realized I was wrong. I apologize. We're going to now talk about promises. Okay. Remember the discussion last week on Pyramid of Doom. The pattern wherein I do some action like an HTTP request, and there's a callback for when it's done. But the callback itself needs to do another one. And there's a callback when that's done. And we get nested inside each other with this sort of spaced out series of activities that occur as each callback arrives. The waterfall library, the async.waterfall library, is a very nice way to deal with that. And if you haven't gotten to the point of using it, you don't have to in this course. You at least have to know about it. You have to be able to read one and understand what it's doing. I'll test on that. But I would recommend you try it as soon as you find yourself willing to make the modest learning curve to use it, because your code just looks a whole lot better when you're done. Now we could use waterfall kinds of things here, but the standard model on client side is different. It's a very powerful concept that is well worth your investment to learn, called a promise. A promise is an abstract object representing a callback, generally speaking, or some other asynchronous action that is not yet done. Thus the name. HTTP post, for instance, returns a promise. In effect saying, here's this object, I'll be getting back to you. That's my promise. No? But it hasn't happened yet. So it's another way of looking at a callback, although again, it doesn't always have to be just a callback. It can be any deferred asynchronous action that you are promising you will do later on. But it isn't yet finished, or not necessarily so anyway. A promise object can be in a pending state, or it can be in a completed state, and as we'll see, also in an error state. So any given promise is a pending and possibly already completed action. And the code that works with promises is designed to deal with all those possibilities, that it may still be pending or that it may already be completed, either way. A promise has as its most important single method a then method. That's the classic method of a promise object. You pass to it one and, if you like, two functions. We're passing only one for now. And that function is the one to be called when the promise is fulfilled. The callback, in effect, on success. An on success callback is the first parameter to then. And this one deciphers the location that we got from our posted session and works with it. So no surprise as to what the code does. It's like any other callback. Importantly, even if the HTTP post happens so fast that it's already succeeded before the then can even be executed to register this function, the thing will still work. If you do a .then and register a function on a promise that had already completed and was done 10 years ago, assuming the code's been run that long, it'll do that function right then. If you do a .then and register a function with a promise that will not finish for another 2 hours, it'll just hang on to the function and execute it then. So whether there is the possibility of immediate execution or delayed execution, it handles all of that automatically. What does our function do? Then is presumed to return another promise. And therefore, thens can be chained if you want. You don't have to return another promise. You can return null if you don't use the result. But if you use the result of then, it's supposed to be another promise. And that means they're chained, typically. And the way they're chained is this. I do a location here. I'm getting the headers from my response. That's the HTTP response that will be passed. That's the result of the promise. And I'll get the location and split that to get the array separated by slashes, and that gets me the last one as the last element of the array, which is the ID of the session. Right? And then I'm going to do a HTTP get on sessions plus that last element of that array. So if it's session 4 I just formed, I'll have that as my location. I'll peel off the 4. I'll do a get on sessions 4 because I want the details about that session. And it returns a promise. Get also returns a promise, which I will, by method chaining, that parenthesis is the end of the then call, I'll do another .then, and on whatever function from promise that returns, I'll do a then on that one. It could return the same promise, and you get a whole series of thens that are all on the same promise, and they'll all be fired when the promise is completed. Or it can be done in this chained fashion where the then of one returns a different one, and then that one will be thened when it's done. So you get this waterfall effect where one comes after another. The next one, if it succeeds, presumes that we will have in our response .data, that is the body. And one thing to get used to, by the way, is that the HTTP library you come to know and love on the node side looks an awful lot like the one that you may use on the client side, but not perfectly. If we're on the node side, it was .body, right? Over here, it's .data. That's the response to get back in the body. And it's JSON, but .data. And it has a person ID. Remember, the REST interface specifies that the session has a person ID member. And so we're using that. Right? Okay, what about error handling? Remember that in the waterfall model, there was like a bottommost function, kind of fall through. In the promise design, that's the catch method. If a promise has an error state that it finishes in and is not otherwise handled, then the .catch will catch it at the end. And in that case, we're going to show a login failed dialog. Kind of looks like this. Well, this will fail rather dramatically. That's my login failed dialog. And we'll look at how that's designed in a bit. So aside from figuring out what this Go is doing, that's the extent of the login controller. Any questions about it? And again, trying to get the feel for this. For each segment of HTML, we're going to have a controller. It may call all sorts of things outside of itself, but it doesn't touch anything in the outside world, not even so much as a global constant, as it turns out, unless it's passed in by dependency injection. The kinds of things that you can get through dependency injection include constants. If you have a general global constant, you declare it as an injectable dependency. You ask for, I want global constant such and such. And in it comes as one of your parameters to be worked on. Again, why does that make any sense? Why not just go get the global constant? I mean, that's the way it would work in a language like Java. What if you want to test it in a rig where that constant is changed? Maybe that constant is the standard URL that we're going to address for our REST interface. And I'd like to be able to swap it out readily and easily, dynamically. If I arrange for it to be an object that gets passed in as a dependency injection, I can do that. And this controller will be none the wiser. It'll just use whatever constant was given it. So you got to get used to that. When you're sitting in the middle of a controller and you want to do something, your first question is, what do I need injected to do this? When you would have asked in Java, what object do I need to new and have a pointer to so I can go call its methods? Here you ask, what do I need to be injected? What's it called? And I'll set up a parameter for it and I'll use it. So got a whole list of things done here. Separation, promises. Okay, so let's look at the notification dialog. We saw in jQuery that you can pop up a dialog, and it even does a fancy deal to make it modal, where it blanks out the back screen and all. There's something similar in the way of a library in Angular. It's supplied as part of UI Bootstrap, which is one of the modules that we connected in when we set up the home application in the first place. And it is provided by a service called UIB Modal. I didn't want to have to use that over and over again because it's so common to pop up a dialog that I wrote my own instead. And that is here in util. Notify dialog and some corresponding HTML. Once again, we're going to have a controller, and we're going to have the HTML that it works with in scope. The dialog is of class modal header, and this is just boilerplate that lets it look like that dialog that you saw, styles it. There's a title, but the content for that title is configurable. It said error, if you noticed when I popped it up for the bad login, and that actually came from over here. When I did a show of the dialog, I passed error, and then the message in the middle was login failed. So apparently we're going to be getting that in some funny way because it's curly braced like that with two curly braces. Let's see here. Close this up a little bit. Save that. Sorry, I just want to get my tabs cleaned up a little here so we don't have too many things to go through. Okay. So apparently that's supplied in some weird way with curly braces, which we'll look at in a bit. And likewise the message is supplied with curly braces. And then finally at the bottom we do have that button that said OK. And apparently it's got another one of these click handlers, or NG notation things that says when it's clicked, do this call. So let's kind of look at what that all is doing. The notify dialog.js is here. And recall that if you have even a little library, not recall it, this is a small library. It has a show method and sets the dialog up automatically. You tell the show method what you want to have as your message in your header. We'll look at the scope in a minute. And it automatically sets up the dialog to do that for you. So I don't have to do this boilerplate work over and over again in other calls. But how do I make use of this code? If you're in Java and you write a small sublibrary, you're accustomed to, of course, being able to create an object of that library and then call methods on it. So get me a new whatever and call methods on it. What do we have to do in this environment so that the controller for login can use the library with the show method that I'm writing right here? The answer, unsurprisingly, is it has to be injected. I have to describe it as an object that can be injected, and it will be passed in to be used as NDLG. Which means it needs a name that describes it as an injectable thing, a service, to use the more precise term for that. So I declared it as a service. That's what's going on in the JS here. Once again, I'm using my global application and the service method of that to say, I want to declare an injectable service that will be called notify dialog, and anyone who wants it will say, give me notify dialog, please. It's almost like the class name. And if you want to then use it, this method will be returning an object that you can then call a show method on. But this one, in turn, is dependent on something else. The $UIB modal is the library that actually does the modal dialog. And so I'm saying my service depends on UIB modal. Pass that to me as UIBM, and I'll use it. So I'm creating a service that requires a standard library for modal dialogs to be injected to me, which I will use, and then I am named notify dialog, and someone else, like the logging controller or anyone else who wants to use me, can say, I need notify dialog, and he'll expect to get back a method, or an object, I'm sorry, on which you can call .show, which is easier than doing all this other legwork that we'll do automatically. So what does the show do? It assigns to a scope the message and the header that were expected. In our case, bad login, I think it was, and error. That scope will then be used by the code in the template in a way we haven't looked at yet. There are various ways you can address the scope. We've seen calling methods of the scope, right, in ng-click handlers. But if you just want to show data from the scope directly in the HTML, you can include in paired curly braces like this an JS expression that will be interpreted in the context of the scope. So when I say header What I mean is scope.header. And when I say or note, that's just standard JS, right? For if this is falsy, then just use note. So it defaults to note, but otherwise it uses the header. And when I say curly braced MSG here, I am getting the scope.msg and putting it in there automatically. So you can stuff expressions from your scope into your HTML anywhere you like by enclosing them in double curly braces. Double curly braces, by the way, is a common notation you'll see in other contexts as well for stuffing computed things into the middle of HTML. There's a templating library called Mustache that introduced that, and it became rather popular as a kind of grouping notation that looks like a mustache on its side if you want to know where the name comes from. Okay. Where did the scope come from? Notify dialog didn't ask for a scope. Instead, the way the UIB modal thing works is you tell it what scope to use. So here's the library function that does open that dialog. Open, and you give it a named set of parameters in the form of an object. We talked about that earlier. You give a JSON object with named attributes. You give it the template URL that you want to have thrown up, and it will automatically put that at a high Z offset above the rest of the display with the right background to keep you from working the rest of the display to make it modal. You give it a scope object, explicitly in this case, and you give it a number of other options, among them a size, and SM is for small. You seem about the right size to have it be a small dialog. And it runs and pops the dialog up with that scope. So we've set up the scope, and we've got the dialog showing its contents. Where did the scope come from? We could actually have created it, but instead we were passed it. That's the way I designed this thing. And if you look back at the login controller, it passes its own scope. So in fact, it's sharing scope with the login page. And that might be convenient if I needed to get information directly from that scope as well. Okay. What does open return? It returns an object describing the open dialog, which has one particular field, result, which is a promise. So there the concept comes up again. Why would a dialog need to return a promise to me? Well, what's going to happen? Remember the pattern of flow with a dialog? You put some information up, maybe the user alters it. They won't even be doing that here. But ultimately, they do an OK or cancel, and they shut down the dialog. How long might that take? I mean, even if the human's awfully fast, his reflexes aren't going to allow him to close it fast in about a second later. And indeed, that dialog could be sitting up there for 5 or 10 minutes if someone walks away for a cup of coffee. It's going to be a while. And yet, I'd still like to be able to follow up with it when it's done, right? Now, here, there isn't a lot of information to enter, so it's not quite as compelling. But still, in general, a modal dialog is a thing that may finish in an arbitrary amount of time in the future, and when done, they need to have some information harvested from it, right? That's what promises are for. And so we save the promise that comes back from it and return that, and going back all the way out to our login controller, the result of this call is expected to be a promise, which we can once again do a then call on to say when the guy finishes up, then we'll do something. Now, I'm just using it to illustrate the idea here because I don't have a lot to do once he's done okay, fine, he's seen it, that's all over, I don't have anything more to do, but maybe I would have in a different dialog, and in this case, I'm at least going to do a console log.done. Console.log.done. So let's look at that here. Well, console, submit my garbage. That's a notification that the post request came back with a bad request, as you expect. It got handled by popping up the notification dialog. And done is not being printed yet. And the promise is not yet fulfilled. Now it's being printed. How do you get the promise to be fulfilled. In the case of a notification dialog, you call $close, which is a built-in that right there, $close. Let's do a design reality check here. While I was standing there talking to you with that dialog hanging up there, we were waiting on the then. And the CPU was paused at that point, right? The whole point of callbacks is to prevent such a thing, right? The whole idea is that you're going to have this event loop going, and the CPU can be off doing God knows what else while we're waiting for that dialog to complete. And when it does, then that need to call the function that is in the then will be on the queue, and we'll pick it up at that time. Obviously, the done wasn't executed as soon as I did the then. This then was instantaneously completed. Filed that thing away as a function to be called when this promise is done in some table somewhere. And then the CPU was off to another stuff. And when I finally fulfilled the promise, then, so to speak, the function was called. That's our logging control. Any questions on that? All right, so what if I want to register? A little more complicated example. I got email, first name, last name, password, confirming password, even a checkbox. And as before, I don't get a submit that's activated until I've entered the stuff I'm supposed to. And when I do, it'll register and come back with a success or failure. Let's look at the code. I'm about to open register. Predict for me what you will see in the way of files at this point. It's getting to be a familiar pattern. Paula? Controller.js and a template. Yeah. There they are. Register template. Same kind of pattern as before, more fields, but same basic idea. And again, an awful lot of ng models apparently tying to a scope which will have a user that includes an email, a first name, a last name, a password. Scroll this down a little bit here. A confirmed password, conf pass, and then a checkbox as well that will have as its model terms accepted. So we're tying pieces of this HTML back into the scope, the user property of the scope, and the kind of property we tie it to depends a little on the HTML. For most of those, it's just a string. But for terms accepted, that'll be a Boolean, true or false. And as I check or not check the box, that'll automatically be updated true or false in the scope, connected together. So what does the JS look like? Pretty simple. We're going to set up scope.user initially having just a role of 0 because that's the default assumption. You can't have other than a role of 0, and there's no way to set it otherwise. Register user was, if you look back at the HTML, called when we clicked to register. We're going to post scope user, and upon response, we're going to go to login. And that's it. What would have happened if I hadn't put roll:0 in there?
There could be an error if they're trying to be a feature admin. They don't have permission.
A little different than that, but you're on the right track. First of all, what is the body of the HTTP post going to be here? the actual user object. We're just passing it straight through. And that means that the names we assigned had to match the REST interface properties. Otherwise, we would have had to do some manipulation to change them. And so if I don't put roll:0 in there, and there's no other way that's going to get set, I'm going to get a missing property. It's expecting a roll. It has to be. Okay? So that would be the reason for having that in there. What is going on with this stuff here? The bottom. ng disabled. Read the thing and tell me why it makes sense based on what we've already talked about. And in particular, tell me what I would have had to type in that dialog to get the button enabled. Steve, what do you think?
It's like the user needs to accept the terms and make sure that the password equals their confirmed password, like the typing the password was.
Right. So as long as those match up. And when will this get checked? I mean, if I type in AB for the password and AB for the confirm, and then I type AB, add a C, and then go back and add a D, when is this getting checked? Constantly. Or to be very exact, as a result of each event handler that is in picked up, and every time I type a letter, it'll be checking this thing over and over again. Right? And of course, the button is examining the content of this input, right? HTML cross-checking each other. Well, it looks to me like this button basically is validating against this checkbox, for instance, and the two are tied together. Shaking heads. It's not the right way to look at it. What's actually happening there? That button doesn't know about this checkbox from a hole in the ground. It has no idea that checkbox is there. What does it know? You're shaking your head, why?
Was there like the wrapper underneath it? I don't remember what it's called.
It's not so much a wrapper, that is the point, as the fact that the HTML pieces aren't talking to each other. What's going on? How do they know about these conditions and what's been done? They're all talking in common to the scope. Each of them is talking to the scope, and each of them is looking at the scope, and whatever the scope does, I could put in there a random number generator that decided whether terms accepted was true or false, and that enable would go on or off based on my random number generator. It's the scope that's making things happen. It's not the HTML that's talking to itself, unless it may be through the scope, but the scope is the coordinating object, right, the model. Okay. See if there's anything else on this. It's time to look at the routing now. I've been talking about how this state go thing would make it go to different places, and that is all in UI routes. And introduces another method of app. See, what have we seen so far at the top level for our module? We can declare a controller with .controller. We can declare a general service, like my login dialog, or any other kind of library you want to make, with .service. In each case, we're identifying them with a name so they're injectable. But this is a different kind of thing. This is configuring. Okay? The fact that I included UI router, or UI routes, I think it is. Fact that I included that Angular UI router automatically makes available some injectable things. The $state, for instance, that we were using all along. That automatically becomes available because of including that library. But it may need configuration. And so the app has a .configure method that I can call to supply configuration code that is run before the entire thing gets set up ahead of time. And we're going to use it here to set up the routes. What URL gets connected to what page, and what controller goes with that page when it is so connected. Back to UI routes. The config method takes a function that will be run when it's time to configure. And understand that it doesn't mean run instantly. Don't forget that when you declare a function, you are not running the function. It may happen later. When we do a then and give it a function, that doesn't mean the function is running right then. It's being held until the promise is fulfilled. And here, we're saying hang on to this thing until the configuration setup time has arrived, which happens somewhat time before the app actually runs, but after everything's been loaded up. And what we're configuring are a state provider and a URL provider, URL router provider. What does this notation here signify with the angle brackets in this? What's going on again? This is mostly an are you awake question. We've seen it half a dozen times already. What does these two words up there in quotes, what do they signify? Gideon, what do you think? Yeah, dependency injections. I'm saying that there are injectable things called a state provider and a URL router provider. Are they part of my code, do you think? Looking at the name, you can answer.
No.
And why do you think they're not part of my code?
It seems like the router, like the basic router functionality, isn't the
Yeah.
JS takes care of.
Yeah, that's a good surmise. And I was talking about them arriving as a result of the include, but you can tell by the name itself without anything more than that. $sign. So $sign prefix, that's a built-in of some sort or other. So they're apparently built-in library things. What is a provider? A provider is a factory that produces another thing. We're going to need a state, and we'll have to have a state provider to produce it. And then there's also a URL router provider. I'd have to look at the docs to know the exact distinction between the two. But the general principle is that when you have a kind of object you need to produce, like a state, there may be another factory object that creates it. And very often those require configuration. And that's what we're doing here, is configuring those two things. We're saying, give me these, whatever they are, whatever providers you're going to make for a state and a URL router, and I'm going to configure them. How do I configure them? When this function is run, they'll be passed as state provider and router. I only do one thing to the router, and that's to give a default. If the routing question has no meaning otherwise, then we just go back to home. That's what that little configuration says. The state provider apparently has a .state method, allowing me to set up one state, which is described first by a name, home, and then by the URL that will imply home, the template URL to be stuck up there, and the controller. I told you at some point I'd tell you how we got this thing all tied together. The router in this application at least does that job. If we are going to the state home, it knows I'm supposed to stick up the HTML for home. I'm going to make a home controller, which we already defined. I'll get that, run that function to create that home controller. It'll set up the scope too, because I gave it the scope. It asked for scope as a dependency injection, and it set it up as needed. And we'll be set to go. And by the way, the slash is presumed to be after the pound. Everything here is after that pound mark. So these are actually fragment URLs. They're not from the domain name. They're from the pound onward. So pound slash. What does the state method return? You can tell by looking at it. Familiar pattern by now. No, it's not returning JSON. Line 14 is a huge telltale as to what the state function returns. And I'm looking for a vocabulary term as well. So we have haven't called in a while. Renee, you have any particular idea on that?
I'm not really sure like the specific version.
What type of thing is it returning? I mean, what would it have to return for me to be able to get away on line 14 with calling dot state? Is there another term I'm looking for?
Promise.
Not a promise. Now, if I said dot then, that would be a big telltale. It was a promise. But there's no deferral here. It's setting this up instantaneously as part of the table, so I don't need to wait for it to be done.
Is it a location?
No, it's not a location. But look, in here, dot state again. I'm calling state providers dot state method, and on the result of that, I'm not calling a dot state method, and on the result of that, I'm calling a dot state method. What the heck allows me to do that? Yeah.
I was gonna say partial, but
No, it's not. I'm not returning a partial. I mean, there's a partial specified here. That is a partial, a little piece of HTML at home, but that's just part of the configuration. Yeah.
Is it just returning the state provider?
It's returning the state provider. What is this called again?
Method chaining?
Method chaining. Method chaining. What does the last line of the code for state say, most likely? It could be done slightly differently, but I can probably tell you what the last line of the state method is. Return what? This. It is returning this so that I can then call another state call on the very same thing for the syntactic convenience or coolness of being able to say dot state, dot state, dot state, dot state over and over again. Method chaining. Return the same object that you were called on so that the very return value is that object, and you can call another method, even the same method, again. It's method chaining. Okay. So I'm apparently doing another state. This one's the register state, and you can see it's a pretty familiar pattern here, right? The URL/register. This is the partial to use. There's the register controller. There's login. Yada yada. It goes on and on. Except the temps is a little more interesting. Apparently there's a state where we're going to go look at the user's attempts. And this one has a rather more complicated URL. And it does at least have the standard temps partial and controller, but then there's a resolve thing. Sometimes when you go from one state to another, you need to pass information along. And the information can be passed in a couple of different ways. Let's take a look at how we do the go, and we'll see how that's working. First of all, every time we've done a go, we've used one of these names, right? So $state.go login, $state.go register. That's the name in use. So from home, for instance, controller, when I say state.go login, that's telling the UI routing system, stick that URL up there, put this partial in place, set that controller up, and now we're talking login. Right? Likewise, state.go register. All of it set up with each of those calls. But the ats call, that was more complicated. Login, once we got that done, we did a ats, and we passed an object that had a PERS ID property. So apparently, when I call go, I'm also allowed to add some parameters. And it's the typical named parameter object thing, right? This one has only one. It could have had more, depending on the context and the need. Where does the PERS ID go, do you think, based on what we were looking at? It becomes just part of the known background here, and you can use it in the curly braces in the URL. So if I pass PERS ID 2 and say go with that to ats, what I'll get is PRSS/2 as the URI, filled in automatically. And then I can also apparently set up something where there's a function I need to call to do some work preparatory to going over to that other page. And that's done with the resolve property. So if I call state and I give it a resolve, I put in curly braces one or more named properties, ats, that are specified by a pattern that should now be very familiar. array, bunch of weird looking strings, and a function that has parameters corresponding to said strings, a dependency injection. So once again, I can say, look, I need to do some work here. Here's what I need to do my work. I need $Q, whatever that is, $HTTP, okay, and $state params. And state params is the URI from here, the pers ID. It's like params in the Node.js environment, same deal. And it's even got the same name, mercifully, this time, instead of being slightly different. So what am I going to do? I'm going to do a get on pers ID with that params PRSS with that params pers ID. It's a get for that person's attempts. And this does, as we know, return a promise. And when that's resolved, we'll get back a body that is the array of all attempts for that person. What is this? I misspoke, by the way. The response is the HTTP response. Response.data is the body that is the array. And we're using that to resolve the promise. $Q is a standard library for dealing with promises. In fact, the abbreviation Q is well known in the promise design world. It was one of the original promise libraries, and so you see that come up now and then. This is an implementation of the Q library for promises. Among other things, it provides a means of saying this promise is now resolved. Now, we've kind of had that happen automatically before, right? When I did the HTTP post, I just assumed the HTTP would magically resolve it when the thing got done, right? But sometimes you have to do it explicitly instead. And when you do, you can say $Q.resolve, and you give it the thing to use for resolving, the value to be passed to the resolving function, response is data. And that'll be the resolved value of the promise. So if we do a then, and we give it a function to handle, that's what will come out of the then, is that response data. We're going to go to the attempts page, right? Apparently on the way, in effect, we need to do a get of all the attempts for this person. We know what person we got, because we just logged in. We need on the way to do this fetch of attempts in the form of a promise. The routing system allows you to do that with this resolve mechanism, and it does have a special rule that it will not proceed on to show the page until the promise is resolved. So it will wait for as long as it takes to get that HTTP request resolved, and then go on. That leads us finally to the attempts page. And I think another break, because we've been at this for a good hour or so. We will look at the attempts controller and how it deals with all this data that it got from the resolve in 10 minutes. Okay, why don't we resume, folks? Kyle was asking about where to get outside material support, and it's probably a good time to do that. As most of you overheard me comment to Amy, this can seem like taking a drink from a fire hose. If it makes you feel any better, I felt exactly the same way when I was learning this stuff. It was like yet another damn weird concept, and it's all done differently than I've ever been used to doing it before. If you feel that way about it, please rest assured it will get better. It's just a lot to hang on to begin with. And then once it begins to be a familiar pattern, you know, dependency injection, you're used to that, and you've seen it before, and, you know, the controller and scope and all becomes familiar, then it's a lot less cumbersome. So you will get the hang of it after a while. I have some hints on how to approach the development of it that I'll go over briefly, but they'll be more meaningful when we do this on Thursday. Because on Thursday, we're getting close to being done with this example now. And we'll either finish it or be very close by the end of the lecture. But on Thursday, I want to go and modify it and actually add stuff. And by that, I mean I'll ask you to work in pairs and do some modification. I'll say, well, let's try this. What do you have? I'll type it in. We'll play around with it, see how it works. We'll do incremental development with this and use some of those strategies so you can see how to approach this. Outside material. The Angular site does a pretty good job. It has an API reference that will give you the usual API kinds of details. It also has a general developer guide that's worth walking through. Each of the different injectable libraries, like the router, the UI router, Angular UI router, will have with it generally you can hunt it up on Google, generally a Git page. And your first reaction is like, Git repo, what, I got to download source and all? No. The Git repo pages have wikis on them at the bottom, and they're really quite thorough, in my opinion. Not tutorial, but at least reasonably detailed. And so if you want to know how to use UIB modal, that's where you go. If you want to know how to use the MySQL library, there's one for that, those sorts of things. And then I have pointed out to everybody, and is, I believe, pointed to on Polylearn now as well, as I have been learning this stuff, I do compare and contrast on textbooks, and I'm not an easy guy to please with texts. I do not generally use a text in a class because I just don't think that the average textbook writer can explain their way out of a white paper bag. But Pro Angular JS, Adam Freeman, he's a pretty well-recognized professional author, and he's doing a good job. I think it's very clear, complete. It shows you different ways of organizing this stuff than the one example I'm doing. Definitely worth spending some time reading. And that is available in Safari books online if you don't want to pay for it. Or not too expensively, I think, in paperback one. It's not some $100 book at all. Any other questions about that? Yeah.
Is that listed in the?
It's in the bibliography, and then I also put an express link because I was feeling good enough about reading it after the last few days in Polylearn. Okay. Let's see. We're going to look at the controller here for the attempts, the one that was routed to from that rather complicated state call in the UI router page we were just looking at when we left. Before we do though, there's an aside I want to make on this pattern, so familiar now in Angular, of a list of dependencies followed by the function that will use them and the parameters that correspond to them. You will find quite often in Angular apps just the function and no list of dependencies at all. In that case, the parameter names in the function will be exactly as they would be for the dependency injection list. They will be the actual names of the dependencies. No UIB modal versus UIBM. It'll be $UIB modal right there in the parameter list, and it's got to be. If you do that, the dependency injection system is smart enough to use JS to take your function object, and this can be done in JS, go in and look at the actual names of the parameters and assume that those are the names of dependencies to inject and inject the appropriate dependencies. But the parameter names have to absolutely match the dependency names. You can't get by with shortened or abbreviated versions at all. And it's generally not a stylistically good approach. It's not clear why that should be. It's more elegant. I don't have to have this big array of names and then the function parameters. I suppose it's awkward to have big $sign parameter names. That's kind of weird, but yeah, it's Angular. The problem is when you minify JS. We've talked about this before. Everybody remember what minifying JS looks like? Right. What does it do to variable names, including parameter names? Down to little abbreviated single letter things so they don't take any more source volume than they have to because you have to load this over the internet. Do that, and the entire idea that you can examine the parameters to get the dependency names from it goes out the window because those parameters' names are going to be changed by minification. So if you are ever minifying your JS, you have to use this notation instead. Minification does not reach in and change string constants. Those are as they are and they change at all. So this will work even under minification. Now, this has got the longest dependency injection list we've seen so far, and almost none of them are used. And the reason almost none of them are used is I stubbed it all out because you're going to be helping me write this thing on Thursday. But apparently we're going to be using, well, $scope as always because it's a controller and its job is to set up scope. So that much we'll be using. Apparently, we're going to be setting up an ats property. We'll be using $state because, although it isn't evident here yet, we're going to be doing some goes to other things. We'll be using HTTP because, again, not evident yet, but we will be doing some HTTP fetching to satisfy some of these. That's a filter, and we're going to be talking about filters in about 20 minutes or so as the very last topic, or one of the last topics of the day. UIB modal, because we will pop up some modal dialogues, not just a notify dialog. We'll handcraft our own modal dialog using notify as an example. This will be used to allow someone to select what game they want to start a new attempt on when we get there. And ats. Where'd that come from? Built in? You can tell by looking at the name. Is that a built-in? No $sign. That's not built in. We've had other ones that were not built in. I had notify dialog, right? And what did I have to do to make that usable as an injectable service? Just create it. That's it. Boom. It's ready to go. What did I have to do to make notify dialog usable in DI, dependency injection? Bring that back up. There. Remember? This thing, app.service. You don't get just to use something as dependency injection because you feel like it. You have to insert it into the injection tables with a name and say, this is a thing someone can ask for. I didn't do that with ats, did I? I didn't do a .service call. So how did it come to be an injectable thing? It came to be an injectable thing because one of the various services of the router is that when you do a resolve, you give a property and a resolvable promise, the property becomes injectable, ats. Only to the controller you're going to. It's like a quick little add to the injection DI tables for just that one controller. And he can get this thing provided by the router system. Just a quick reality check. Does he have to wait for it to resolve? Because it is, after all, a promise. Nope. The router system, I said, waits the promises out before it goes. It assumes that you really need this data. You can't just kind of start the page without having that data. And whatever value the promise resolves, whatever is passed to the resolve function, that's what you get, actually, for the injectable. Not even the promise itself. You get the result. Thus, in fact, response data is what we'll be getting. And that, as you may recall, from the call to get attempts, if I do a get of attempts on person ID, there, /attempts, is an array of information on all attempts that person has, either completed, or quitted, or currently pending. And that's what we'll display. The page we're talking about is this one. If I restart it or not, I might be able to just go straight there because I think I'm already logged in. Let's see if that works. No, I'm getting connection refused. Oh, wait a minute. Oh yeah. No server. Sorry. Okay, so we will have to log in. Wrong. Might change this guy's password, it's too long. So this is the page we're looking at. And apparently what it provides us with is a series of entries for all attempts that the person has thus far done. And it has it in a reasonably nice format. There's a button for starting a new one too, but there's for each attempt the challenge that was done and the state, which can be the quit or done or working, start time, a score if there is one, or NA if there's not. That's what we're going to be generating in the HTML. And the only thing that the scope will supply to do that is this ats property that it got by injection. this array. But this requires a little bit of thought. What's that HTML going to look like? Because the answer array could have one element in it, essentially possibly 0 elements in it, or it could have 100. How do I make the HTML have enough divs to match the size of the array? The answer is that it's another Angular directive. And by the way, the term directive is another Angular term. It means any special attribute or even tag name, there are some that it supplies, that is understood by Angular and is used to modify the HTML under configuration control. So HTML directive might be a better term for it, but it's just directive. The button for starting a new attempt is unsurprising. That's what we've had before. And apparently it calls start new attempt in the scope, which is that dummy function, just as a console log right now. And then there's this, ng repeat. If you attach that to a div, what you're saying is, underneath this div, I want 0 or more children, the number of such children to be determined by iterating through an array or an object in the scope. And the notation is specifically at, which will be a loop variable, in, and then the variable from scope, ats. You then give an example of what you want for one such iteration. And that's understood to be a sort of template that will be repeated as many times as there is a entry in the iteration. And you can use at, the loop variable, within it. So what do I do? Well, I'm going to make a button, and the challenge name, it was a button. And we're going to do a call of check at with at ID. So let's see, we have a series of attempts. They each have an attempt ID as one of their properties. And I'm going to pass that actually to check at, which is the scope function to check an attempt. Let's look at that briefly. Right here, it's expecting an attempt ID, and it says check at whichever. So that will cause us to be able to do the following. Watching the console here, check at 1, check at 2, check at 3, or perhaps further along, an HTTP request to get that attempt and get all the steps in that attempt and build another page and go to that page showing all the steps for that attempt, which is what we'll build on Thursday. And back to the template. Okay, what else have we got in here? Sorry, I really need to close some of these. The label. Ats have a challenge name, right? It's one of the database fields. And it's come all the way up through the HTTP response to us, unchanged as a property, and we're going to use it as the button name. That's why the buttons were given those names. And again, there's that mustache notation, do so, which is simply a quick way of saying, go to the scope, get this thing, stuff it here in the HTML. The panel body is the little 3-part list of properties for the attempt. And panel body is another one of those built-in classes from the Bootstrap UI library that makes the panel look nice. We're going to have a state, and there again, a mustache notation. We'll talk more about it in a minute. A start time, and a score. Of all of these, the score is probably the easiest to understand. If the attempt has a score greater than or equal to 0, that means it was done. If its score is -1, that's the default value. That means there's been no score given yet. So we have a question colon notation that either uses that score if it is non-negative, or NA if it is negative. So that's how we got those little NAs in there. Now, if I did not have the @state pipe in there, this would probably be fairly easy to understand. So let's take that out, this out, save it, And by the way, I'm going to use this not only to illustrate the concept I was about to do, but also an important general point about what it takes to do an update when you're working with the client side. I just saved that file, so I should now be able to see the results, excuse me, here, right? Remember this sequence. I can't count the number of times I've forgotten one step in it and then been baffled for 3 or 4 minutes. It's like the classic old, I forgot to save my damn edit file and I was compiling the old version. How come I can't just assume that this will not change its behavior because I've just saved that file? First of all, where is the file that I just saved? Which side? Server side. It's in the public directory. It'll be served up if requested on the client side. There is a copy of it on the client side. But what I just saved is over on the server side. It's not in the browser at all. So I need to refresh the page, right? And that's important. You have to refresh the page. But even that won't quite suffice because Node.js reads the public contents and caches it. So it isn't necessarily going to refetch that file just because I changed it. It may have a cached version of it that is ready to send back if requested. So to be really certain, I get to do the same old drill we have many times before. Now I'm not certain, sometimes it might work, so don't assume you always have to do this, but in general it's safe to do this. Let's see, and if I refresh now, I'm going to be told that I am unauthorized because I just restarted Node and all my sessions went out the window. So, I am going to shorten this because I've typed it too many times. Okay, so there we go. Now, finally, that's what it takes. And remember the full drill. Save the file, probably restart Node, refresh the page. Otherwise, you're not going to see the change. And you'll be sitting wondering why your perfectly correct bug fix isn't working for 10 minutes until you realize that you didn't want to do one of those. And you know how I know that that's the case. So what happened here when I removed those little pipes? Any difference? The state, it's numerical. It used to be a nice little working, quit, done. And the date, did you notice? Zulu time, down to the millisecond, not exactly user-friendly. So, what I removed are called filters. And at a first glance, they seem like a trivial aspect of Angular, and yet they turn out to be very important. A filter is a formatter. It's a little broader than that. It can be used in general to transform any kind of input data into any kind of output data. So it follows a model of you give me an input thing, I'll produce an output thing. But its most common use is to format data for visibility. And in the curly-braced mustache notation, it can be applied with what should not be viewed as an OR. It's easy to look at that as like an OR. It's not. It's a pipe, like a Unix pipe, feeding this into that. Right? A greater than sign might have been a better notation, but this is what they chose. Yeah.
You have an extra low like 7.
Let's see. Oh, so I do. Thank you. Oh, smart aleck editors. Okay. Sometimes Adam really irritates me. So the pipe through date is a built-in. Provided automatically by Angular. There's a suite of them, and you can find them in the Angular API documentation. It illustrates yet another thing. Sometimes filters have parameterization, and that is expressed in the case, when we get down to actually building one, we'll find that it's a function, and it takes an extra parameter in that case. But the way you provide that in the notation in mustache braces is by a colon and then a value to be applied. Date filter has various options for the date, long, short, and if you want to get even more deeply into it, you can elaborately set up your own format string and it'll follow that as well. Short sufficed for what I needed, and that was what you were looking at in the earlier version where it was just a neat little short date with the time. What about at state? think we can be fairly sure that's not built into Angular since it's rather specialized to our application. So I had to define my own filter for that. And how did I do that? Remember that piece that I said we'd get back to at the beginning of the whole lecture in, what was it, THS app? I used the Angular object to declare my main module. That was what we started with, and went off from there. But I'm also doing a filter call. Let's try my favorite drill question here again. What does the module method of Angular return? Any guesses based on what I'm doing? This, it's a method chain. The Angular object allows a number of calls to set things up, among them declaring a filter and a module, declare the module, then the filter. So I'm actually declaring a filter here. You know, I think I misled you there. I'm sorry. No, I think it returns the module, actually, because the filter is a module property. My apologies for that. So it's actually returning the module that was created, and then we're doing a filter call on that. There's another injectable thing. So we have a name for it, @state. Although it gets a little weird here because the assumption, because it is a filter, is that it will be injected as @state filter. You don't add the suffix. It gets added for you. I don't know who designed this. I think it's a bad idea, but that's the way they did it. So you get that automatically added for free. And to show you what I mean, when I injected it in the @JS, that's controller, there it was @state filter. What do I do to set it up? It's actually pretty simple to set up a filter. What you have to do is provide a, well, it's a little complicated, a function that returns a function. That's the complicated part. You provide a function that makes the filter. The filter itself is another function returned by the first one. Now, when you look at something like this, function that returns function, you begin to wonder if it was just designed by somebody who likes functional notation. Do I really need to do it this nested? I mean, why not just return the filter function and be done with it? The idea here is, first of all, this function is not going to be executed right away. We are setting up a deferred execution that will occur later on once everything is up and going. And it may never be needed. It may be that this filter is never called for. And while this one's simple, another might be rather complicated. So we're not going to bother to create the filter itself unless it's really needed. We thus have two functions going here. The factory function, the outer one, which may or may not be called, depending on whether I need that filter. And then what is usually termed the worker function, which is the actual filter that will do the job of transforming data. Another advantage of this notation, by the way, is that we get the possibility of a little closure here. So the factory function can have some constant values that will be used by the worker function. In this case, an array of what I want each of those index values 0, 1, or 2 to be converted to. And then the worker function is simply given an input, which would be the integer value, and it returns the appropriate state names, actually. Not rocket science here. And we're done. So to give an example of the power of the idea of a filter and why it's a major concept, not a sidebar in Angular, obviously for things like dates and all, you want a consistent formatting rule. But in IHS, we make an effort to internationalize our strings. And the whole error tag system, remember, is designed with that idea in mind that we might have internationalized error strings. So we just have tag identifiers. There are internationalization libraries that basically provide really powerful filters. And everything you do in the way of an output takes the form of tag name, identifying the string you want to say in whatever language, pipe, internationalization filter. And it's pre-configured to know whichever language you want to use, and takes your tag name and spits out off of tables the appropriate internationalized language string. So this has a lot of applications that's beyond making dates pretty. And it's an important Angular idea. Any questions about the filters? Let's see here if I covered all the bases I wanted to. Let me give you a brief rundown, like I said, of debugging and processing, and then let's try our hand at doing one small change here before we get into it more deeply on Thursday. First of all, and I'll put this in printed form for you too, as well as verbal. Have all of the different tools in play. There are a half a dozen things you're interactively using while you're debugging one of these. Obviously the browser and the console, the debugging console. The Node console. Two different things, right? One appears down with Node, one appears in the browser. The MySQL client. I find myself often going back and checking, did this make it through to the database or not? It failed, did the database at least see it or not? And this is familiar ground for you on the client side, or server side at least. All the relevant docs, I've opened a browser. Example code to build from. I don't think that there is any more than one Angular app that's ever actually been written. All the others have been modified from existing apps because there's so many patterns that are assumed and wired into this thing that you tend to do a lot of copy, cut, paste, and modify, and that's fine. It's an appropriate way to build Angular code. Postman, or an equivalent, because when the call fails, you're going to want to go and try it by hand, make sure that the REST call is working or not. Number two, I find it a lifesaver to develop very incrementally. Now, you all know this drill by now, working in new environments. I'm sure you've learned to do things a step at a time. You do things a real baby step at a time with Angular, because there's so many ways the damn thing can go wrong. I found myself just taking one little REST call and doing a console log print, seeing what was going on, checking the database, debugging 3 or 4 things, and then another little REST call, one thing at a time, until you kind of get the flow of it. You really don't want to just sit down and write even one whole controller. It's 2 or 3 lines at a time, and check and check and check and check. And that way you'll be able to debug it less painfully. The mediocre documentation, and I would describe a lot of it as mediocre, and the non-orthogonal library design, the combination of that in any kind of an environment means you're going to be doing some reverse engineering. Pretty much guaranteed. You know what I mean by non-orthogonal library design? An orthogonal library, it's kind of a feel more than anything else. All its parts are designed so you can use them arbitrarily in any possible combination. They're all orthogonal to one another, can be applied in any combination you like. Java's libraries tend to be quite orthogonal. Angular does not smell that way to me. A library that is got parts, but you're supposed to use them in a certain and very particular way. And if you don't use them in that way, God knows what's going to happen. That's a non-orthogonal library. Angular is a non-orthogonal library, in my opinion. There are going to be ways you could combine these things. They're just not really anticipated, and they're going to screw up. And more importantly, are not going to be documented as to what will happen. So in that kind of environment, it's just a fact of life that you do some reverse engineering. What will happen if I do this weird thing with UIB modal? I don't know. Let's try it out and do a console log and find out. The docs won't tell you. And just be used to that possibility and work accordingly, but careful step-by-step testing and experimenting. Watch out for that save refresh cycle. Save the files, restart node, refresh the client side. And by the way, you'll probably find it very useful if you have not already to get yourself a JS linter. People know what I mean by a JS linter? A linter is an analyzer of code that finds minor errors, in particular syntax errors. I have not bothered to set this up in Atom. Atom has a good one, the Atom editor. But you really want something that will tell you when your curly braces don't match instead of having to go through all that crap and re-log in and then find out there's another missing curly brace. Because the cycle of restart and retry gets lengthy when you're going from server side to client side and restarting everything, something that'll check for minor errors is worth it. Of course, in Java, that would be a compiler, but JS doesn't have any such thing. A linter is the closest thing you get to it.
So Adam does it line by line, as you said.
I don't know if it's a line-by-line linter so much as a flag, a gutter flagging linter. But one way or another, at least it doesn't require saving the file, restarting node, going back, re-logging in because you restarted node, and then finding out once again that you missed a semicolon. All right. You know where the term lint comes from, by the way? It's a very old term. It's from the 1970s. C used to be an even worse language than it is today and have even weirder possible wrong things before it was standardized. and they had a program called lint, literally, that was designed to, thus its name, pick the lint off of your C program. And smart C programmers ran their code through this just to get the source code analysis done ahead of time. And ever since then, the technology and the approach has been called linting. Bit of tech history for you. Okay, so if there are no other questions, we've got 10 minutes, and I don't want to waste them. I want to do something with this attempts page. Any other questions at this point? All right, then let's try modifying the attempts page so that it will be a little friendlier than it currently is. Right now, if I log in, it just shows me my attempts. I think I'd like a header label on the top that says attempts for Clint Staley, or first day, last day, whatever the user's first and last names are. We need to accomplish that. So, step at a time. Let's start with the HTML. It's probably the easiest thing to do. And just in case there's any doubt about it, I'm going to call on people at random for this. So, what would you think you probably need to do in the HTML to get this to happen? And remember, you can make reasonable advanced assumptions about what you're going to do elsewhere, and we'll fill that in later. I want attempts for, say, Clint Staley to appear then with the user's first and last name on the top, so that I know I'm logged in as so-and-so, and these are my attempts. Okay. So Stephen, Tom, try. Okay. I'm going to do an ng text. I'm not familiar with ng text. You sound like you're a little more familiar with Angular, perhaps. I'm just going to do an h2. Let's do a header. Turns out that Angular does redefine the header styles to look nice, especially if you tag them properly. Yeah. How's that sound? It'll just work in my case. I'm good with it. So what do you think I'd have to do instead? Yeah, they would change. Exactly. So what am I going to have to do in this HTML to make them change? Specifically, I'm not going to write some JS code to modify them by hand. I would if I were working jQuery. I'd just go in and alter them as soon as I logged in. Tweak the HTML, but that's not the way Angular likes to think. So what do I have to do instead? Mustache notation. Excellent. So let's see here. What will the mustache notation be referring to if I use it? Where is it going to get its data? Say again? Okay. We could say ATT if we wanted to. But remember, the ATT, if you mean this one, that loop only applies, it's kind of a make-believe variable that only applies within the ng repeat block. And so it will not be visible or knowable outside of the ng repeat block. What does any mustache notation get its stuff from ultimately? A scope. So I need to assume there's something in the scope that will supply this. There actually isn't yet. I think maybe you were trying to hopefully get something from the existing scope that would do the job, but there isn't. So we're just going to assume we'll be adding stuff to the scope. Right? How about a property that is the user? I mean, we could do a first name and a last name, scope that first name, scope that last name, but that's a little like non-modular. And besides which, we're ultimately going to be getting this, I think, from the REST interface. And that gives me a user object. And so let's just assume we're going to get a user object. Well, what are the fields of that user object? I think they're first name and last name, aren't they? So let's see here. What do I need to do? Scope.user.first name remember, I'm perfectly capable of making bugs for the hell of it. So, yeah.
Do you have to type scope?
Not only do I not have to type scope, I must not type scope. It's presumed. And indeed, if I did this, I would have a baffling error in that those would be undefined, because scope doesn't have a property named scope. And they would have assumed that's what I was somehow weirdly meaning to do. And, let's get rid of those. Okay. That's good. Now all I need to do is have those in the scope, right? Okay. So let's see here. Let's save that off. Let's go down to controller. There we go. Works for me again. But it's not an entirely stupid thing to do. Why is this not a stupid thing to do at this point? This is Angular. You can get nailed 85 ways to Sunday. You don't want to even do a tiny thing without checking it. So let's make sure that that actually worked. Because maybe I did forget and put scope.firstname or scope.user.firstname, and it blows up on me, and now I can find that out easily instead of wondering if maybe there's something wrong with my get call instead. So let's get that fixed. All right. Now what do I have to do? Okay, so I'm good now, right? I restarted the node and I saved the file. Right? Again? Refresh. Oh yeah, I forgot. Because right now, if I go and look at sources, let's see here. Actually, let's just try it out without the refresh and see what happens, just to kind of make the point. I hope this works as I planned. Oh, actually, it did refresh. Okay, so it was actively getting the page. I was okay with that, but sometimes it won't. I'm pretty sure it'll change the HTML, but I would actually have to change the JS as well. So yeah, I don't know. All I know is sometimes it doesn't work. So there we go, as advertised, right? Okay. So now all I got to do is actually fill that user in with the real thing. Question?
So I was going to ask if we can go back to the scope to see how we add the user.
Mm-hmm. Definitely planning on that right there. So just a quick JSON hack in is all I was doing, right? Okay, so what I really want, of course, is so how am I going to do that? I'll tell you right off, it's not in the ats. Can't get it from there. That doesn't have the information we need. So even though we may not know more than that it's not in the ats or those other things, there is one thing that we are absolutely, positively going to have if we're going to get that information from outside. Say again? Well, sometime we'll probably get a REST call, yeah. But I'm thinking even more fundamentally than that. This is a dependency injection system. You don't see nothing if it wasn't injected into you. There is no outside world to contact or to talk to unless it came through here. And nothing there is going to give us what we need. You have to get that instinct down. There's a tendency to think that, like a normal programmer, that I can go get this information from this or that library. No, you can't. Not if it wasn't injected into you, because all you got is what's being passed in. You'll notice there's no member functions here. There's nothing else. But you're making them, but there's nothing given to you as a function. You don't have with this object even. It's all about DI. So I'm thinking first up and most importantly, I'm going to need a user, and I think we're going to DI him in here. Thus. If I had swapped those ats user in the parameter list, would I have been okay? The DI list has to match the parameter list exactly by type and order. And this is JS, of course, you're not going to get a compile error. All that will happen is weirdness will happen because you think that the ats ought to really have an array, and instead it's actually the user and it has a first name, and you wonder why it's not working right. So again, careful about that. Now the question is, how do I inject him in there? Now, we do have general services that we can inject in. We've built that. And we have also the library stuff, all the $sign stuff, but there's no $sign that's going to give me my user. There's a good example, though. How did we get ats? Where did that come from? Because that's just injectable. I guess all we need is something like that, right? Where did it come from? This controller was set up by what? UI routes. Came from UI routes. Among the things you can do with a UI route is when you're going to go jump to a new controller and a new HTML, a new little triple of scope control HTML, you can also throw in some injectables, which is a good thing because very often you need them. And we thus have in UI routes the need for another injectable. The resolve does that, right? And I have ats in there now, but I could add more stuff. Let's see, I gotta make sure I get all my curly braces correct here. I believe that is the end of ats. It's actually an array because it's got the DI notational thing going, right? So let's put something else in here. I'm allowed to set up a function that creates a promise that will be resolved, and whose resolved value will wind up being the property user that can be injected. All right. So how am I going to do that exactly? Well, I'm pretty obviously going to do something like this thing, right? But I will need my state params, will I? I'll need Q just to mess around with promises, and I'll need HTTP because I'm doing an HTTP call here. Do I need the state params? The state params provided me the parameterizable stuff in the URL, the person ID in particular. I need the person ID. Same as I did to get his attempts, I'll need it to get him himself. So I'm going to just kind of yank and put here at this point. Okay. Yeah.
Are we not creating a new state because attempts has all the information we need?
We are.
Well, like we did for register login.
Oh, how come we're not doing a whole new state controller triple? Because the page I'm looking at is one unified set of HTML, and so I want one scope for it to address. You can, as we'll see later, or as you'll see later, actually, I don't know if I have time to do it in lecture, set up pages where the different parts of the page come from different scopes. So we could have a scope just for the header and a different scope just for the attempts. That's an acceptable design, but it's more complicated. I'd rather just keep the one scope we got for the one page. One partial, one scope, easy.
So the state ETPS is linked to
Say again?
the state ETPS is the scope of that attempts page.
Right, and the full story is $scope was a dependency injected, and whatever the scope is that your controller is supposed to work on, that's called $scope, and you can inject it, and you pretty much automatically do because you want to mess around with it. And then we named it state in the parameter list because I don't like $signs floating all over the place. And then we attached property to it. All right, so this is probably about where we need to be here. I think there's not too much change. What change do I need to make here? Drop the ats. Blow that away. So now I'm just going to get pers ID, and it's the same resolve of the function and all, and resolve of the promise, and it'll be called user. Oh, we got a chance here. Let's see what. If not, we'll debug it tomorrow. I'll hold you in later. But let's see if we can get it working now. Let's see, it's better than 50-50 at this point, although you never know with Angular. Okay, let's go on over here. So we'll have to debug that next time. Or do we? Can you tell me what it is real quick?
Yeah, he's very good.
Minor details. There we go. That's another thing, by the way, is this whole chain, this passes through, this passes through, this. It's easy to miss one of them. And the result is, as you can see, now. Any bets this time? I'll give it 75%. Ah. Something going on there. Okay, so our mustache did not work, and the necessary